If you could grow just one crop, what would it be? Well, for me, it has to be tomatoes, because only by growing your own can you select the very best tasting varieties and pick them at the peak of perfection. Hi, I'm Ben, and if you've planted tomatoes, you'll of course be hoping for a trouble-free crop. But to get that, we'll need to show our tomatoes some love to put them in the strongest possible position. Let me show you how. Making sure your tomatoes are properly supported is one of the most important things you can do to avoid rotting fruits and to prevent disease. The best time to get it right is early on, before the plants get too big, but how you support your tomatoes depends on what you're growing. Now, this type of tomato here is a vining or indeterminate tomato. Left to its own devices, it would just sprawl along the ground. We want to grow it up off the ground, not only to make the best use of space, but to avoid problems with soil-borne diseases such as Septoria leaf spot. I'm just growing them up these canes here, big sturdy canes, and just tying them in at regular intervals using this natural twine here. Other benefits to growing vertically include better light levels and, through careful pruning, better air circulation. Here in the greenhouse I've gone for a different approach, using this string here. It's tied on right at the base of the plants, and then to secure the plant to the string I simply weave it around like this. And then as it grows up, I'll keep on weaving the stem in a counterclockwise direction. Now, this is actually best done in the late afternoon or even the evening, and that's because plants will have become a bit more supple in the warmth of the day, making them more pliable and amenable to weaving round the string. Another great option for supporting tomatoes is to use cattle panel or stock fencing like this. You just roll it out, cut it to size, and then secure the ends together with zip or cable ties, and you've got yourself an instant tomato cage. Bush or determinate tomatoes don't need nearly as much attention. They are much stockier and shorter than vining tomatoes, but even these types will benefit from some sort of support, especially as the plants get laden with heavy fruits. In all cases, the aim of the game is simply to keep the plants off the ground to reduce the risk of disease and, of course, to stop fruits from rotting should they touch the ground. It's tempting just to let plants grow nice and big. After all, that should mean more fruits, right? But actually, letting plants grow away unfettered can cause more problems. Another way to help avoid the disease risk is to actually remove the lowest leaves. Simply snapping off or cutting off the lowest leaves also helps to improve airflow in between the plants, which will reduce the risk of airborne diseases such as blight. Now, you can do this at any point, and ultimately you can prune off all of the lowest leaves right up to the first truss of flowers or fruits once the plants are a little more established. And for our vining or indeterminate tomatoes, we also want to remove the side shoots, also called suckers. Now, you can see here that these appear where the leaf joins the main stem. Any shoot there just needs to be clicked off and removed. This is best done early in the morning when the plants are still quite firm. They'll just give a nice clean click then and come off very cleanly. All of this will help to improve airflow, and in the case of vining tomatoes, by removing those suckers, you're helping to concentrate the plant's energy on producing more flowers and fruits. So long, suckers! It's worth checking for suckers or side shoots regularly. I've been away for a week, and you can see this one has grown very big here, so it's a little bit too big to snap out really, but there we go. Now I'll tie that into the cane here. Well, that's this bed nicely pruned and tied into their supports. The only other thing I'll need to do later on, once these outdoor plants have set about 4 trusses of fruits, is to stop the growing point of the tomato. And let me just demonstrate what that means. That simply means pinching out the very tip of the stem between your fingers and thumbs like that. And what that will do, along with side shooting or removing those suckers, is concentrate all of the plant's energy later on in the summer into producing their tomatoes. Don't worry about this plant. I'll let another side shoot grow to replace this one and then tie that up, so we'll still get our 4 trusses here. And then in the greenhouse, I will pinch out my vining tomatoes there once they reach the top of the roof. Oh, magic. Now, where do the tomatoes get the energy they need to stay fit and healthy and ward off disease? The nutrients from the soil, of course. And a soil full of nutrients and moisture will power good growth as well, and of course fruit production. Now, if you've improved your soil before planting, in my case with an inch or 3 centimetre layer of compost, then you probably don't need to add any more. But what you may want to add is a mulch. Now, I'm using grass here. It's been laid out on the lawn and dried out a bit already, and I'm just going to spread it all round. What this will do is several things. It'll help give weeds a bit of a hard time. It'll help lock in that moisture because it's covering it from the hot sun, and it'll keep the roots cooler as well, which is really good in a hotter climate. Another real benefit in the case of tomatoes is it provides a barrier between the soil and the leaves here, so that when you water, there's less likely to be splashback of soil onto the leaves, which will also reduce the risk of disease. The other great advantage of a mulched soil that has a more steady moisture level is that you're much less likely to get a couple of problems in your tomato fruits. The first one is fruit split, when after a long dry period plants are watered and all that water rushes up into the plant and causes the fruit to split because the flesh suddenly swells up and the skin can't keep up and it splits. The other issue is blossom end rot. It's a lack of calcium, but rather than it being a lack of calcium, it's more often a problem of the plant not being able to circulate it around the plant efficiently because of a lack of water. So that mulch will avoid both those problems. My greenhouse tomatoes are growing in straw bales, so they obviously won't need mulching. And the straw bales actually offer a really consistent moisture level at the root zone because they're so big. If you're growing in containers or grow bags, it really is important not to let the potting mix dry out because it's a real pain to re-wet once it has. Now, an irrigation system may help with this, or growing tomatoes in larger containers, which are slower to dry out. And remember, you can also mulch containers in exactly the same way as in-ground plants. If your container tomatoes do dry out, don't worry, sit them in a reservoir of water and let it take the water up from the bottom, and the potting mix will gradually swell and expand as it takes in that moisture. So how often should you water? The answer is, it depends. In my temperate climate, I might water container tomatoes, say once a day in warm, dry weather, dropping down to maybe twice a week when it's cooler and cloudier. Tomatoes growing in beds and borders will need watering a lot less often than that. If you're growing in a hotter climate, of course, you will need to water more frequently. But please don't overwater your plants, because as well as having potential growth problems, the tastiness of the tomatoes will also be reduced because they will actually become more watery. If in any doubt whatsoever, just do the trusty finger test. Stick a finger into the soil about an inch or so deep where the roots are and feel. If it's cool and moist, don't water. If it feels dry, then get on a water. And to water, we want to avoid wetting the leaves and avoid the soil splashing back up onto the leaves. This will help with disease control. This is where, of course, pruning and mulching really help you out. Tomatoes are quite hungry plants, but nevertheless, you may find that plants grown in the ground with lots of compost that was added before planting won't need any additional feeding. But plants in containers, grow bags and straw bales certainly will. I like to use a purpose-sold liquid tomato fertiliser. It's got all of the nutrients that tomatoes need, including all of those micronutrients, to ensure absolutely top-notch growth. Plants can also be fed with a homemade liquid comfrey tea. Now, I planted some recently of the variety Bocking 14, which is a really well-behaved variety for the garden. It doesn't spread. I've got to wait for it to bulk out first before I can harvest the leaves to make my own tea. But to make it, it couldn't be simpler. Just cut and stuff the leaves into a bucket, weigh them down with a brick and leave them for a couple of weeks. Then it'll ooze out a black liquid. You can just drain that off, bottle it, and then when you come to use it, dilute it 1 part of the comfrey concentrate to 10 parts water, and your tomatoes will love it. Blight is the most widespread risk to our tomatoes. It's notorious for cutting down plants in their prime, dashing hopes of summer-long harvests. This soil-borne disease is carried on the wind, so it's just about everywhere which has warm and humid conditions. But there are precautions you can take to try and avoid it. Make sure to water carefully, taking care not to wet the leaves, and water in the morning if possible, so the soil surface has a chance to dry off during the course of the day. As I mentioned earlier, cut off those lowest leaves so there is no foliage in contact with the soil and soil can't splash up onto the leaves when you water. And encourage that all-important airflow. Pruning off the lower leaves and side shoots will help, but make sure plants are properly spaced too. If you're growing in a greenhouse or tunnel, open up the doors, vents and windows as wide as they go to encourage good ventilation. Tomatoes grown under cover will be a lot less susceptible to blight, but they are by no means immune, so do be careful. Do be sure to inspect plants carefully for the very earliest sign of the disease and remove infected material as quickly as possible to avoid it spreading. If you can, avoid growing tomatoes and potatoes close by because the disease can spread between those plants. And of course, at the end of the season, be meticulous in removing all material of both potatoes and tomatoes to the compost heap so nothing's lying around in the ground that could reinfect next year's crop. You can find varieties that claim some resistance to blight, but really, if blight is a severe problem, then growing undercover is your best way to avoid it. At this point, it's worth mentioning one of the more notorious pests of North American gardeners, and that's the tomato hornworm. Hornworms eat the tomato foliage, really weakening plants. They're bright green, so they don't exactly stand out against the foliage. However, a little tip for you is to head out at night with a black light or UV light. The caterpillars then actually glow in the dark when they're shone upon, like little disco divas, making them very easy to pick up and remove. Taken together, these simple steps should power your tomatoes through the growing season, ensuring truly trouble-free plants and of course a delicious harvest. If you would like to know more about growing tomatoes, then why not have a sticky beak at our tomato playlist? There's lots of top tips in there to help you get the most from your crop, including how to get your plants to fruit in the first place and how to store and enjoy your harvest. Or perhaps you've got a tip of your own. If you have, you know what to do. Drop us a comment below and share it. Next week, I invite you to join me on a full, no-holds-barred tour of my garden so you can see what else I'm growing. We'll have a bit of a natter along the way, and I'm sure there may be a few ideas and tips to nab for your own garden. The best way to catch that is to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can let you know once it's up and ready for you to watch. In the meantime, happy gardening, and I will catch you next time.